Morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are joining us from. Thank you so much for taking the time to listening today. We're just waiting for a few more participants to join in, and then we'll kickstart in a minute. Let's say 5 past the hour. Let's give it 2 minutes, and we'll start in 5 past the hour. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you're joining us from. Um, my name is Afshin Nazir, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar that is being hosted by the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AFRODAD. And today we are going to be speaking about a subject that I believe is long overdue. We're going to be talking about odious debt, what it is, why it matters for Africa, and we're going to be looking at it in the context of three countries: Kenya, Mozambique, and Senegal. Now, I'll set the scene before I introduce our panelists and hand over to them. So I'll begin with a very simple question. Now, let's say our government is borrowing without the consent of its people, without benefits accruing to the citizens, and with the awareness of creditors, and the proceeds end up in the bank accounts of officials or foreign actors. Now, the simple question is, should the people of that country be compelled to repay that debt? Now, instinctively, the answer would be no. And yet, across Africa, this is exactly what is happening. Citizens are repaying debts that they did not consent to, that they did not benefit from, and that they did not even know existed. And this happens while hospitals go underfunded, schools are deteriorating, and social services are collapsing. So, Africa's financing gap currently stands at about $200 billion per year. And to bridge it, African countries borrow. But when that borrowing is coercive or corrupt or opaque, then it does not bridge the development gap, it deepens it. And for every dollar that was borrowed in sub-Saharan Africa between 1970 and 1966, approximately 80 cents of that flowed back out as capital flight. So let that sink in. The debt stayed, but the money left. Now, it's against this backdrop that AFRODAD began doing research on odious debt. So we developed a paper which is titled An African Analysis of the Odious Debt Doctrine. Now, that forms the intellectual foundation of today's webinar. Now, the paper does something that has not previously been done on the subject. The odious debt doctrine, it has existed in international law since 1927, but it has always been defined by Western and creditor interest as opposed to an African perspective. Now, in its original formulation, the doctrine holds that sovereign debts contracted without the consent of the people, not in their interest, and with the awareness of creditors are unenforceable under international law. And this is a powerful idea, but it has not achieved binding normative status. And as currently formulated, it does not fully capture Africa's realities. So what does our paper do that's different? Our paper changes that. It looks at the doctrine in a different manner that reflects more accurately Africa's realities. So our doctrine looks at two core elements: the lack of consent and the failure to serve the interest of the people. Under that paper, the research that we've done, we also argue that it should not be limited to just political transitions, but should be available at any time. So removing that temporal limitation. And we also formulate a taxonomy of different types of debts that should be considered odious in today's context. And the paper also draws a link between illicit financial flows and odious debts because they operate in sort of a revolving door format. They operate when there's lack of rule of law and through the same transnational networks, and addressing one is the most effective way of addressing the other. Now, we'll be examining this odious debt doctrine today through three cases or three situations. There's the Kenya, Senegal, and Mozambique situation. So in Kenya, we have the odious debt petition before the High Court that's challenging over 13 trillion shillings in debt. In Senegal, we have a post-election audit that was ordered by the new government in 2024, which revealed that the previous administration had concealed approximately $13 billion in public debt. Then for Mozambique, of course, we have the tuna bond scandal involving approximately $2 billion secretly borrowed without parliamentary approval and with a significant portion laundered through offshore accounts. So these are three different countries, three different circumstances, but the same underlying story. These are debts that were contracted in the shadows at the expense of the people. So to help us unpack all this today, we have panelists or experts in the field. Four exceptional panelists. I'll let them tell us how they're involved in the present or in the past in the particular situations. But without further ado, I'll quickly introduce each panelist before we head on to the first question segment. So we are joined first of all by Dr. Henry Paul Kishana. He is the Devolution and Public Finance Lead at Katiba Institute. He is an advocate and he holds an LLD from the University of the Western Cape and an LLM from Pretoria. He specializes in devolved public financing in multi-level government contexts. He's previously taught at Pretoria, Strathmore and Kabarak Law Schools, as well as the Strathmore Business School. Welcome, Dr. Kishana. We have next Mr. Elimane Kane, who is the Executive Chairman of Legs Africa, and he's a public policy and governance analyst based in Dakar, Senegal. He's the former governance lead at Oxfam Senegal and the Executive Director of Forum Civil, which is the Senegalese chapter of Transparency International. He's also a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity at the London School of Economics. Next, we have Mr. Borges Namire. He is a seasoned researcher, currently a research consultant at the Pretoria-based Institute for Security Studies, ISS Africa, working on governance, peace, and security in Mozambique and Angola. He also worked closely with Mozambican civil society organizations, particularly the Budget Monitoring Forum or the FMO, providing research and analytical support to advocacy and accountability efforts in relation to the Mozambique hidden debts case. And last but not least, we have Dr. Marie-Louise Aaron. She's an international economic lawyer and researcher specializing in international tax and sovereign debt law, African sovereign debt and governance. She's an academic, legal scholar, and policy expert whose work focuses on advancing debt justice, equitable global economic governance, and sustainable development across Africa. So welcome to all our panelists and welcome to all the attendees. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to attend and for your interest in the conversation today. Just a few housekeeping items. One, interpretation is available at the bottom of the screen in French and Portuguese. So at any point where a panelist switches to a different language or you prefer to listen in a different language, please feel free to switch to interpretation at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, please save them for the chat. You can put them in the chat box. You can save them for when we are done with the initial interventions. You can put them in the chat box, or you can even ask them by raising your hand at the end of the first segment. I hope that is clear. And without further ado, we'll start with the Kenyan situation. We'll turn our attention to Dr. Henry Paul Kishana. Now, Dr. Kishana, without speaking to the specifics of the ongoing proceedings, can you walk us through the circumstances surrounding Kenya's debt accumulation and why those conditions raise questions of legitimacy under the odious debt doctrine? And also, as you're doing that, You worked heavily with us on the paper that I've mentioned on the African analysis of the odious debt doctrine. And one of the items that the paper proposes is removal of the temporal limitation that the doctrine should be available at any time, not just the time of political transitions. So in Kenya, the petition appears to be testing this proposition. Now, what does this tell us about the evolving scope of the doctrine? Over to you, Dr. Gishana.
Thanks a lot, Afshin, and the team that organized this. On behalf of Katiba Institute, we're grateful to have worked with AFRODAD to develop the paper that is the subject of our focus today. And generally speaking about the Kenyan situation, we currently have a case before the High Court in Kenya that was brought by an individual who's been an activist and at the forefront of public interest litigation in Kenya. And essentially, as Afshin mentioned, one of the proposals that we make is when you look at the classical definition of odious debt and the odious debt doctrine, there is an assumption, an underlying assumption that it ought only apply at the end of a transition or at the end of one regime, then the incoming regime, then the rights under the odious debt doctrine are then conferred on the incoming or the subsequent or the succeeding regime. But one of the arguments we're making is that then takes away, it builds into that system perverse incentives, and there ought to be a space ought to be made for contestations of odiousness in even with respect to the current sitting regime. And one other recommendation we made is that the people who are shelved in the classical sense of the odious debt doctrine ought to be made the center of the focus of the odious debt doctrine, and ought to be given also the power to be able to initiate proceedings for the declaration of odiousness of debt that has been procured contrary without their consent and contrary to the laws of that particular country. So that recommendation that we made with respect to the people is actually what is also happening in Kenya, that it's no longer the regime or the government that is actually contesting the odiousness of debt that has been procured by previous regimes, but is an ordinary Kenyan citizen who's actually lodged this application before the High Court. And essentially the contention is that is contesting the debt which accumulated between the period of 2014, 2015 to 2024, 2025, a period of about 10 years. And his argument is that the regime that came into power in 2013 found Kenya's debt to be about 2.37 trillion Kenyan shillings. But by the time the regime was leaving office in 2022, that debt had increased to about 8.579 trillion, which is an increase of about 6.208 trillion Kenyan shillings. So in one regime of about, in a period of 50 years since independence, the argument is that we only accumulated about 2.3 billion Kenyan shillings, trillion Kenyan shillings. And then now in a period of only 10 years, we have accumulated 3 times that particular amount of debt. And generally, it's not just about the accumulation. The accumulation is not a problem if that debt can be seen, there can be a demonstration of what that particular debt was used towards. But there are about 3 or 4, 5 main contentions which I'll be able to just focus on that have been brought up in the case, which we have also identified for purposes of the court's determination. So generally, the argument is that, look, public debt ought to proceed from a pre-authorization by the people. So there's that acknowledgement of popular concern that public expenditure ought to be pre-authorized. In the context of Kenya, Parliament, the Constitution under Article 220, 221, 22, 23 provides very elaborate provisions on how a budget ought to be formulated and approved. And part of that budget formulation process is the requirement for parliamentary authorization, the National Assembly's authorization of not only the expenditure, but also the revenue raising measures, including borrowing and all other forms of public liability. Now, one critical contention in this petition is that, look, part of that debt that we are contesting. And maybe to just give some form of context, Kenya's public debt at the moment is around 13 trillion Kenyan shillings, which is about 68.9 billion USD. And in GDP terms, that is about, so it depends on which source you're looking at. So it's about between 68% of the GDP to about 71.5.6% of the GDP, which is way above what the law requires or sets as the ceiling for Kenya's public debt. The ceiling is 55% with a wiggle room of about plus 5% in exceptional cases. So the high debt that's beyond the required threshold, one of the arguments is that it was accumulated without the approval of Parliament. And the second argument is that there's also a requirement under Kenyan law that, look, if you are going to borrow, we're only going to allow you, when you look at sections 25, when you look at section 15 of the Public Finance Management Act of Kenya, there are two forms of borrowing that are permitted, short-term and then medium-term to long-term borrowing. For medium-term borrowing, it's restricted to borrowing to finance development expenditure. Essentially, it means, and also it goes hand in hand with the constitutional requirement that the burdens and benefits of the use of resources and public borrowing ought to consider the intergenerational impact or ought to facilitate intergenerational equity. Now, to ensure that we don't borrow for purposes of our consumption needs, Section 15 of the Public Finance Management Act requires that all medium to long-term borrowing be for development purposes. And development essentially means borrowing for the creation and renewal of assets. And that is the second argument that is being made in this particular case, that look, all long-term, medium to long-term borrowing that was incurred between this period of 2014 to 2015 and 2024, 2025, the long-term one cannot be linked to specific development spending. And the other argument that is being made is that when we borrow, you don't just borrow for purposes of using it for personal use. You have to also demonstrate what is the public use to which you put this particular proceeds of borrowing. And that leads us to the third argument, that all this borrowing that we've incurred, we cannot be able to trace it to specific expenditure. And therefore, that use or that public benefit that ought to have arisen from public borrowing cannot be proven. The fourth argument is that the proceeds, so our constitution under Article 206 requires that every revenue that is raised or received by the national government or any other entity that receives money on behalf of the national government ought to deposit all that money in the consolidated fund for purposes of ensuring that the checks and balances provided for under the constitution for withdrawal and expenditure of public money from the consolidated fund are actually complied with. Now, the problem we have, for example, with the Eurobond, which was incurred in Kenya a while back, is that the Eurobond was, the proceeds of this borrowing were deposited in a foreign account. This foreign account, and the money was not rerouted back to the consolidated fund account in Kenya for purposes of facilitating the constitutional process for repayment of public debt and expenditure. So money, once it was raised, put in a foreign bank account, and then used directly from this foreign bank account to repay a particular consolidated, a particular loan, a syndicated loan of about 600 million Kenyan shillings. The argument that's being made is that when you use money directly from borrowing to repay a public debt, then you circumvent the requirements under the Constitution that requires or places checks and balances to ensure prudent and responsible use of resources. There's also an argument that's also being made about, should we peg our repayment obligations on, or our capacity to repay debt on GDP, or are there better measures that we can use that then prevent a situation where we are in consistent a cycle of borrowing to finance our expenditure. So the question of debt to GDP as a basis for debt sustainability is also challenged under these petitions. So essentially, all these arguments largely center around one of the taxonomies that we've identified in the paper, and that is the taxonomy we call internally invalid public debts. Essentially, internally invalid public debts are debts which have been procured contrary to the internal laws of a particular country. And what that then does in terms of using the lens of the odious debt doctrine, once the absence of consent, the absence of benefit, and creditor awareness. One of the things we've argued in the paper also is that creditor awareness is not a salient component when it comes to the determination of whether a debt is odious or not. It's only a mitigating factor once the question of the legitimacy of the public debt has come or has been brought up. So the two conditions which we've argued in the paper, one, the lack of consent, and two, the lack of public benefit, squarely come out in the Kenyan case in the sense that, look, all this money that has been borrowed, about the contested amount is about 6.9 trillion Kenyan shillings. And the argument that is being made is that this money, one, was borrowed in a way that was illegitimate, in contravention of our constitution and our laws, public finance laws. And therefore, and another thing which our laws do, for example, Article 226(5) of our Constitution allows for the imposition of personal liability for public officials that either directed the use of money or approved the use of money in a way that led to the loss of public funds. So the argument that is being made is that if we can, one, the fact that you violated our laws, our internal laws, means that you did not obtain our consent. Because again, as you understand, the laws, the constitution, and the laws that are passed in a particular country constitute what is referred as to the social contract. It's the way people have agreed on how they demonstrate consent. We demonstrate consent through our elected leaders in parliament, which also in some cases include elements of public participation in the passing of budgets and the formulation of laws. Therefore, if you fail to follow the laws that then dictate how we illustrate our consent at the international level, then we say then you did not have our consent in the procurement of this particular public debt. And then two, if two, you cannot be able to demonstrate what did you spend the borrowed money on, essentially it meets the second also criteria or the second limb on the question of the lack of public benefit, essentially therefore making such borrowing odious and therefore subject to the odious debt doctrine that we are trying, the argument we're trying to make under the odious debt doctrine. Now, that is the Kenyan case. The case is before the High Court, as I mentioned. We have mentioned it. We are involved as Katiba Institute as interested parties, and we're trying to guide the court in the understanding of the law with respect to public borrowing and also with the applicability of the odious debt doctrine. Now, when you look at that, and also coming to the second question that you raised, Afshin, on the question of the implications of these on the scope of the odious debt doctrine, essentially what we're looking at a doctrine that we're looking towards for purposes of eventually finding justice, in the sense that, as you mentioned at the beginning, that if we did not consent to a particular public debt, that public debt was not used in our interest, then we do not have the obligation, we should not be saddled with the obligation to repay that particular public debt. Now, you realize that this odious debt doctrine is, technically speaking, is still emerging at the international level. And one of the things that we're trying to do under the paper is to be able to look at it and ask ourselves, as presently defined and conceptualized at the international level, does it have our interests as Africa? And some of the things we pointed out, obviously, is that there are aspects of our history, both social, economic, and political, our political history, our economic history as well, and our social circumstances and development, political developments that make it uniquely common amongst African countries, that the ways and we've accumulated this debt are common in such a way that we would benefit from a common front, a common approach to addressing the question of odious debt and accumulated illegitimate debt in Africa. So when you look at the scope of odious debt as originally conceptualized, there's a very narrow and a very supply-driven conceptualization of the odious debt doctrine, especially when you look at the third criteria on the question of creditor awareness. So if, say, for example, a country as Kenya takes debt without following our internal laws, uses it for personal ends, and obviously we don't benefit. What the original conceptualization says is that you have to demonstrate that the creditor was aware that we did not issue the consent. Yet our argument we're saying is that that scope is very narrow, because it is upon the creditor who sits on the supply side of this borrowing in question to also satisfy themselves as to what are the basic primary laws of the country to which we are lending to. What are the constitutional stipulations with respect to capacity to borrow? What are the constitutional stipulations with respect to the procedure for borrowing and approval, the grant of approval for borrowing? So if you want to absolve the creditor on the basis that they were not aware, then essentially what you're saying is that a creditor can lend, even though they understand that the lending is contrary to the laws of a particular country, yet be absolved of responsibility where that money cannot be shown that it was used for the benefit of the population of that particular country. So when you're looking at the scope, we are thinking that it would benefit, obviously, we've talked about the issue of the regime, the transition, that it ought not to be tied to a particular regime. Two, that we need to actually centralize the people, put the people at the center of the definition of odious debt doctrine, to ensure that because of the political economy of public borrowing, that the political class is the one that borrows, that uses, and that if we also give them the sole obligation to initiate proceedings for declarations of odiousness, then we have a problem where now they don't have the initiative or the motivation to actually initiate proceedings. Therefore, if we allow the people the right and the standing to be able to initiate court processes for the declaration of odiousness, then we are able to improve. I don't know, Afshin, you may want to also let me know if I've gone over time, because obviously we are here and we can be able to have these discussions as we go on. But essentially what we're saying is that, go ahead, Afshin. How much time do you say I have?
Sorry to interrupt. I could give you 2 more minutes to wrap up, and then we can always revisit.
Oh, thank you. So one of the things that we are also saying is that, look, the way the odious debt doctrine is configured as at the moment is from an all or nothing point of view, where we are saying that once there is a finding that a particular debt is illegitimate or is odious, there is the expectation that then the entirety of the debt is unenforceable. But what we are arguing is that the odious debt doctrine also provides an equitable basis upon which we need to be able to determine the rights and obligations of parties under international law with respect to that particular debt. Our argument is that once a finding of odiousness has actually been found, then the doctrine ought to allow for the equitable determination of rights and obligations. One is, it's possible to have a debt which was obtained without consent, ending up conferring public benefit. So if we take an all or nothing approach, the people of a particular country will benefit from a debt, but then say we did not consent to it and fail to repay. And therefore, to balance the obligations and the rights of parties, we're saying that what needs to be looked at is the equitable rights and obligations of parties, where benefit can be proven, then the people may be required to repay a particular debt. But where, say, for example, there was consent, but there was no benefit that was conferred on the people, we're saying that, look, as much as the people may be absolved from repaying this particular public debt, from the considerations of equity, we can allow the creditor to pursue these individuals for purposes of reclaiming the money that they then borrowed and used for their own benefit. And essentially that tallies with Article 226.5 that allows for personal liability when it comes to the misuse of public funds. So in general, the argument we're making is that the scope of the odieuse debt doctrine as currently conceptualized is very limited. And therefore, we need to look at it using equity as the underlying consideration and as an exception to Article 38 of the ICJ statute to mandatorily require that equitable considerations are used for purposes of determining the rights and obligations of parties in a sovereign debt contract to ensure that the people in a particular country are then not saddled with debt burdens that do not benefit them. So I'll stop at that particular point of shape, and then now if there are any other further discussions, I can be able to see how to build in anything that I may not have actually mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kushana, for that intervention. You've given us an overview of the situation in Kenya and also brought out the elements of consent and benefits. And also, you've rightly pointed out that the creditor awareness element is more creditor-centric, and it's not a conceptualization that favors the African reality in its current state. And you've really emphasized putting people at the center, and that is something that is happening in Senegal. So on that point, I will turn to Mr. Elimane, who is working with under Lex Africa in an audit. So, Mr. Elimane, Lex Africa is involved in an audit of Senegal's public debt at the moment. And can you explain to us what the objective is of this audit, what methodology is being used to assess debt legitimacy in that situation? And also, if there are any key findings that are coming out of this audit so far, what are they revealing, and what's the impact of those findings? Are they telling us anything important about the external or domestic nature of that debt, and what is the meaning of all of these findings for Senegal?
Merci beaucoup, Afsine, pour cette introduction. Je dis bonjour à tout le monde. Alors, nous allons partager l'expérience du Sénégal, en commençant par dire que l'histoire au Sénégal, c'est en fait ce qu'on appelle le scandale de la dette cachée. Alors, ce scandale, il a émergé de manière prééminente après l'élection d'un nouveau régime. Le nouveau régime qui a été élu en mars 2024. Comme vous le savez, au Sénégal, on a une loi qui date de 2012 et qui dit qu'à chaque fois qu'il y a un nouveau régime, le nouveau régime doit faire la situation de référence des finances publiques, du budget et de la dette. Alors, il faut préciser que c'est la première fois que cette loi a été appliquée au Sénégal. Et donc, cette opération a permis au nouveau gouvernement de faire la situation financière du budget et de la dette, ce qui devait se faire dans les 3 premiers mois. Et ensuite, cette situation du gouvernement doit être auditée par la Cour des comptes sénégalaise. Donc, c'est la Cour qui est donc dédiée aux affaires financières, aux comptes publics. Et donc, c'est à partir de ça qu'a été révélé par le gouvernement ce qui a été appelé la dette cachée, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a eu une grande différence entre les chiffres officiels qui ont été donnés par l'ancien régime et les chiffres réels qui ont été découverts après cette audit-là. Donc, ça a créé un problème au Sénégal. Et parce qu'il faut dire pourquoi ça a créé un problème. Ça a créé un problème parce qu'il faut rappeler qu'au Sénégal, comme dans la plupart des pays de l'UEMOA, et même les pays qui travaillent avec le FMI, alors il y a des critères de convergence qu'il faut, comme on appelle les critères de Maastricht, qu'il faut respecter. C'est-à-dire qu'il ne faut pas que le niveau d'endettement dépasse 70% du PIB. Il ne faut pas non plus que le déficit budgétaire dépasse plus de 3% du PIB. entre autres. Donc, c'est ce qui a fait que la révélation des chiffres a été scandaleuse parce que tout simplement, les chiffres qui, au départ, avaient été annoncés par l'ancien régime dans l'avant-révision à 74% du PIB, c'était déjà 4% de plus de la norme, mais se sont révélés être finalement, selon les derniers calculs qui ont été faits, avec un autre rapport, en plus du rapport de la Cour des comptes, qui disait qu'on était à 99,67% du PIB. Un autre rapport qui a été fait par le cabinet Forbes-Mazars et ensuite le dernier bulletin statistique de la dette du Sénégal a finalement montré que cette dette était à 132% du PIB. C'est-à-dire ce qui renvoie à quelque chose comme 43 milliards de dollars américains. Alors donc, vous constatez que la dette a fortement augmenté entre 2019 et 2024, parce que c'est la période qui a été auditée, et même entre 2014, c'est-à-dire 2012, quand le régime qui est sorti était venu au pouvoir, la dette était à moins de 40%. Parce qu'il faut le rappeler, le Sénégal avait bénéficié en 2008 donc, de l'initiative d'annulation de la dette. Mais cette dette a commencé à augmenter ensuite. Maintenant, à moins de 40% en 2012, on en est arrivé finalement à 2024, à la fin du régime en place, à près de 132%. Voilà, c'est ça, c'est le nouveau chiffre. Et donc, voilà que cette dette a fortement augmenté dans cette période avec une accélération qui a été marquée surtout entre 2022 et 2023. Vous me demandez d'expliquer comment ça s'est passé. Mais d'abord, je vous dis quelle est la structure de cette dette. Cette dette, elle est fortement une dette extérieure, une dette publique extérieure, donc il est à peu près 67%. Et aussi une dette intérieure, c'est-à-dire la dette extérieure, c'est cette dette qui est libellée en devises, c'est-à-dire en dollars, euros et autres, etc. La dette intérieure, c'est celle qui est libellée en CFA, et donc qui est de 40%. CFA, c'est donc la monnaie locale dans l'Afrique l'Est francophone, donc espace UEMOA. Alors, donc, la dette extérieure publique, elle est garantie, représente presque 70% du PIB en fin 2024. Donc, ce qui confirme une dominance dans l'augmentation. Maintenant, la structure de la dette aussi extérieure, elle est multilatérale, donc ça dit 40%, elle est multilatérale, c'est-à-dire environ 10 milliards de dollars. Et les principaux bailleurs, c'est la Banque mondiale, c'est la Banque africaine de développement, le FMI, la Banque islamique, Afreximbank et la BOAD. La BOAD, oui. Ensuite, il y a la dette bilatérale qui est de 20%, environ 5 milliards de dollars, qui est répartie entre la Chine qui a la grande portion, mais la France aussi. Ensuite, d'autres pays comme Japon, Inde, Corée, Koweït et Turquie. Ensuite, il y a aussi les obligations, les eurobonds, donc qui font 20%, donc environ également 5 milliards de dollars. Et il y a aussi, au même montant, c'est la dette commerciale non obligataire, c'est-à-dire cette dette commerciale qui a été directement contractée dans les banques privées, surtout les banques privées qui sont dans l'espace IMOA. Et donc, ce qu'il faut remarquer, c'est qu'il y a une grande partie de la dette cachée, comme on l'appelle, qui provenait de décaissements qui sont non déclarés sur les projets multilatéraux et bilatéraux, mais qui étaient des projets connus, mais qui n'ont pas été déclarés, et ainsi que des dettes bancaires qui sont hors circuit budgétaire. C'est important de le dire parce que la loi dit que toute dépense et recette au Sénégal doit être autorisée par le Parlement. Alors, on se rend compte que beaucoup de cette partie de la dette, qui finalement est chiffrée à 13 000 milliards de dollars, alors n'est pas passée par l'Assemblée nationale. Donc, c'est en quelque sorte une dette illégale, hein, parce qu'elle n'est pas autorisée par l'Assemblée nationale. Ensuite, on a vu que également, il y en a eu beaucoup de ces transactions-là qui ont utilisé des circuits parallèles, qui n'ont pas respecté la loi parce que la loi a désigné les institutions qui ont autorité à faire des décaissements et des encaissements. Et donc, il y a eu beaucoup de cette partie de la dette-là qui est passée à côté, qui a été fait à côté. Donc, il y a ce caractère illégal, aussi bien de l'endettement que de l'utilisation des flux financiers de cet endettement-là qui pose problème. Et sur ça, on peut revenir tout à l'heure en intéressant la question de la dette, de la dette odieuse. Alors, mais comment tout ceci est arrivé et s'est accumulé pendant cette période-ci? Alors, donc, comme je l'ai dit, à partir de 2012, il y a eu un nouveau régime. Et le nouveau régime avait mis en place un plan qui s'appelait un plan Sénégal émergent. Donc, avait décidé vraiment d'être très agressif sur les investissements pour transformer la structure économique au Sénégal. Et ça demandait beaucoup de ressources. Et donc, ce régime est allé chercher des ressources un peu partout, et donc en oubliant de rester sur les règles préétablies. Et ce qui a amené à ce régime à jouer sur les chiffres, parce que comme je l'ai dit, les critères de Maastricht limitant le régime, donc ce régime était obligé de cacher ses écritures pour pouvoir continuer à profiter des eurobonds, à profiter de la dette multilatérale et bilatérale, etc. Donc ça, c'est quelque chose qui justifie, qui explique les écarts qu'il y a eu et toutes ces transactions-là qui ont été cachées du circuit normal. Donc, on peut dire que ces emprunts ont financé des initiatives qui sont liées à cette ambition de transformation structurelle de l'économie du Sénégal, avec l'espoir que les recettes futures liées aux découvertes des hydrocarbures, parce que c'est ça le contexte sénégalais aussi, il y a eu des découvertes d'hydrocarbures depuis 2014 qui ont commencé à être exploitées donc à partir de 2024. Donc, c'est tellement ce qui est motivé l'engouement des autorités à l'époque. Mais ce qui se passe, c'est que la plupart de ces investissements ne sont pas des investissements vraiment structurants et c'est des investissements non productifs hein, qui, certes, quelque part, ont des impacts sociaux, mais sur le plan des montages financiers, ne sont pas productifs ni compétitifs et donc créent plutôt des charges à l'État dans les comptes publics. Alors donc, à partir de là, il faut dire que l'audit officiel qui est principal, qui est le rapport de la Cour des comptes du Sénégal, qui a été fait en février 2025, couvre la période, comme je l'ai dit, de 2019 à mars 2024. Et donc, cet audit a confirmé et a élargi les audits intérieurs qui ont été commandés par le gouvernement. Et également, il y a eu l'audit Forbis-Mazars qui a réalisé un examen complémentaire de la dette. Alors, donc, à partir de là, on peut interroger même les instruments qui ont été utilisés et les dettes concernées. Donc, en termes d'instruments, il y a les emprunts externes. Donc, ce sont plutôt les engagements bilatéraux, mais également multilatéraux, comme je l'ai cité. Il y a aussi ces opérations hors budget et qui sont dissimulées. Donc, cette dette bancaire qui est contractée en dehors du circuit normal du Trésor, y compris donc les crédits directs, les certificats nominatifs d'obligation, les substitutions de débiteurs. Certains ont même ensuite été convertis en titres d'État, par exemple. Il y a aussi toutes ces garanties-là et éléments extra-budgétaires. Donc, garanties souveraines, décaissements qui sont dissimulés sur les projets connus, mais dont on ne voit pas les traces. Opération donc irrégulière du Trésor et ensuite un surfinancement qui est utilisé à mauvais escient. Il y a aussi également des manipulations de l'attachement des recettes, c'est-à-dire des jeux de calcul sur les comptes qui transfèrent des recettes d'une année fiscale vers une autre année pour tout simplement réduire donc les montants. Donc, c'est vraiment une entreprise de tricherie pour essayer de se conformer aux critères de Maastricht, mais surtout pour essayer en fait, de pouvoir emprunter davantage et davantage et davantage pour faire face aux ambitions politiques. Donc, ce qui fait qu'en fin 2025, donc, ces estimations de la dette ont été, comme je l'ai dit, 119% selon le premier rapport du gouvernement, mais aujourd'hui, avec le dernier bulletin statistique, à 132% du PIB. Maintenant, à partir de là, comment nous pouvons caractériser la dette odieuse dans le cas du Sénégal? C'est ça une question qui est aussi importante. Je pense que pour ce qui nous réunit aujourd'hui ici. La première chose, c'est que je pense qu'il est important qu'on puisse évaluer les investissements qui sont faits avec la dette et aussi les décaissements et les non-décaissements qui n'ont pas été faits et qui sont quand même prévus dans le budget. Donc, ça nécessite un audit beaucoup plus poussé et une évaluation de ces investissements-là pour prouver est-ce que ces investissements réellement ont eu un impact et ont pris en charge les préoccupations des populations. Donc, ça, c'est un élément important quand on parle de dette odieuse. L'autre élément, c'est la nécessité d'évaluer la responsabilité des créanciers aussi, surtout les FMI, la Banque mondiale, mais aussi même le rôle de la Banque centrale de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, la BCEAO, mais aussi des pays les plus grands prêteurs créanciers comme la Chine et la France. Alors, parce que je vais revenir sur le FMI particulièrement, qui est le pivot de tous ces créanciers-là, parce qu'il donne le signal aux autres, et interroger les responsabilités du FMI dans cette affaire. Mais également évaluer surtout les pratiques de spéculation des détenteurs actuels des obligations. Ça aussi, c'est un élément important parce qu'il y
Sorry to
a eu une
interrupt, Mr. Limani. Sorry to interrupt. You have about 2 minutes to wrap up the intervention, and then we can always revisit.
Okay, let me finish with this. OK, donc c'est ça. Et ensuite, l'architecture du système de paiement international qui justifie ce qu'on appelle la dette pathologique. Donc, ce que dit debt justice par rapport à la responsabilité des spéculations des détenteurs actuels des obligations, c'est que pour le gouvernement du Sénégal, qui doit quelque chose comme 26,5 milliards de dollars de dette extérieure, sur ce montant, 41% sont dus à des créanciers privés et 40% à des créanciers qui sont multilatéraux et 19% à d'autres gouvernements. Et ce qui veut dire que ce qui est important ici, c'est qu'il y a un taux d'intérêt, des taux d'intérêt qui sont très élevés et que les échéanciers les plus courts sur la dette envers les créanciers privés. Alors, ce qui signifie qu'en 2026, par exemple, 62% des paiements de dette extérieure, principale et intérieure, sont destinés à des prêteurs privés. Alors, ceux-là, ils font des bénéfices d'environ 42% bénéfices sur l'émission et 92% de bénéfices au prix de mars 2026. C'est-à-dire, sur l'émission, mais ensuite, en rachetant les dettes, ils font encore davantage 92% de bénéfices. Donc, ça, c'est un problème qu'il faut étudier pour voir. Le FMI aussi, il y a eu plusieurs critiques qui ont émergé dans le cas sénégalais. Par exemple, il y a des lacunes de surveillance. Donc, il faut interpeller les responsabilités du FMI dans les lacunes de surveillance. Malgré que le FMI a fait beaucoup de missions répétées depuis 2019, elle n'a pas pu détecter la sous-déclaration massive qui a été faite, surtout la dette externe qui est sous-estimée de plusieurs milliards. Également, sa dépendance aux déclarations nationales, mais également son impact sur les programmes, parce que le programme a été suspendu, un programme de 1,8 milliard de dollars a été suspendu, et les conséquences sur les investissements sociaux que ça devait avoir sur les populations, etc. Également, il y a constaté un manque de vigilance sur les opérations hors budget et les garanties et les pratiques irrégulières et très élevées. Donc, pour dire qu'il y a beaucoup de responsabilités qu'il faut situer pour caractériser cette dette odieuse, et ce qui nous a amené à mettre en place l'initiative sur l'audit citoyen de la dette, dans laquelle l'ex-Africa est co-initiateur avec d'autres organisations comme FRAP et autres, etc. Nous avons saisi les autorités pour les demander de mettre en place le comité d'audit citoyen, mais également de pouvoir faire une commission parlementaire pour pouvoir démontrer clairement donc, le fond de cette dette et prendre les mesures nécessaires pour pouvoir donc, qualifier non seulement une partie de cette dette et donc aller en négociation avec les créanciers, avec tous les concernés pour pouvoir au moins bénéficier d'une suspension du remboursement de la dette, ce qui permettrait à l'État du Sénégal de pouvoir souffler un peu avant de pouvoir continuer dans la gestion active de la dette. Voilà. Donc, on peut poursuivre après s'il y a des questions.
Thank you, Mr. Limane, for really highlighting the situation in Senegal. You pointed out how the debt to GDP ratio has really skyrocketed to 132%, which is about 3 times what it used to be initially in 2012. And so also the composition you're highlighting of the debt, there seems to be a mix of both external and domestic, and external is mostly to bilateral creditors. And relating back to odious debts, you've highlighted for us that parliamentary approval was lacking, there was non-compliance with legal frameworks, and also the aspect of consent, even knowledge of the citizenry is missing, bringing in elements of odiousness. So thank you so much for that recap, and we'll also revisit any points you may have missed. Maybe we can briefly come back to them during the next question and answer segment, as well as how the audit, a little more about the audit as well in Senegal. So now I'll move to the Mozambican situation, and for this I'll turn to Mr. Namire. So we've looked at the current situation in Kenya as well as Senegal. For the Mozambican one, it's more of a lesson now. It's something that's concluded, more of a lesson. So, Mr. Namire, you were involved in the journey in Mozambique as part of the FMO, and the FMO's role was central in Mozambique's tuna bond scandal. So can you walk us through the FMO's journey in this regard with the tuna bond scandal? And also, does this constitute in the Mozambican situation an application of the odious debt doctrine, even though the doctrine was not explicitly named? Over to you, Mr. Namira.
Thank you, Afshin, for inviting. Yes, well, maybe FMO, which is a forum of Mozambique civil society organization or NGOs, was very relevant to help Mozambique get a court decision to not pay the debt. So maybe we start by explaining that the Mozambique hidden debt of 2 billion USD was contracted by government of President Gibuza 2 years before the end of the term. Actually, the money was transferred to Mozambique, not to Mozambique, but to the companies that received the money. So the contractor which provided or sold the military and fishing equipment, the money was transferred. The contract was concluded the same year of the end of the term of the president. So that is very symptomatic how outgoing government is contracting 2 billion USD debt to a country. And to understand 2 billion USD at that time represented something like 1/3 of all Mozambique GDP. So that is a lot of money. And most importantly, that money did not go to Mozambique. It went to the companies, the contractor, and at least this is what was possible to prove in different jurisdictions in courts. 10% of all that amount went to pay bribes and kickbacks. So that is what was possible to prove. But also there are 500 million USD, which is 25% of the total amount, which just disappeared somewhere. No one knows where the money is. So the case was discovered because the creditors feared that they will not be paid their money. Mozambique defaulted, was about to default because they indexed the debt to gas. Mozambique discovered huge quantities of gas in northern part of the country near the border with Tanzania, and was expecting that would pay back the debt by the gas revenue. However, the gas and oil and gas market is very volatile, so a lot happened. The project got delayed, so Mozambique was not able to pay. So when the creditors saw, which is Credit Suisse basically, and the Russian VTB, when they noticed that Mozambique was not paying, was not able to repay the debt, then they went to Wall Street Journal to reported, oh, there's a hidden debt there from a poor country called Mozambique, somewhere in Africa. And then FMO, which is a coalition of civil society organizations, started the advocacy. And the advocacy was really challenging. So to respond to your question, what FMO did was a whole set of advocacy activity, which included mobilizing 2,000 verified signature of citizens above 18 years to challenge the case before the court. Because in Mozambique, to bring the case before the constitutional court, you need a minimum of 2,000 verified signature of a citizen. That is really difficult in a context of an authoritarian regime where people who challenge the government decision, the dissenters, um, are retaliated. They face retaliation from the government. They face repression. So it was really challenging for FMO to bring 2,000 verified signature of an ordinary citizen to bring the case before the court. So that was possible because of a good leadership and good mobilization, good leadership which allowed a good mobilization from the organization. So this is the first lesson. First lesson, civil society organization need to be united, and be strong and work together and challenge even the most authoritarian regime which could retaliate this action. And effectively, there was a retaliation, and I can talk a little bit more about the retaliation during the Q&A, but united civil society organization was really necessary to bring this case before the Constitutional Council or the Constitutional Court. Second, bringing the case before the Constitutional Court in Mozambique was not enough, because this is a case of international debt, which the contract was signed in London. So only the English court were the one that could take decision on it. So Mozambican civil society also needed to challenge the case before international justice. And so Mozambique went first to South Africa to challenge the extradition of Mozambique Minister of Finance, who was being arrested in South Africa under custody of South African authorities. Mozambique government wanted to bring him back home to Mozambique, and in Mozambique he will not face an independent justice, because in Mozambique the judiciary is not independent like elsewhere in other sub-Saharan countries. So more civil society again through FMO and its member challenging the extradition of Mr. Chang, the former Minister of Finance, and willing openly to that the minister or the former minister should be sent to the US to face a real justice. So that was a very difficult time, politically speaking, because you can imagine that all kind of government praise singers coming and saying, oh, look, what kind of citizen are you? You want your fellow citizen to be extradited to United States. You work to CIA. You work to foreign governments. All that kind of threats and things that we know from the African governments. But the importance of sending the former Minister of Finance to United States is that that is the only place that he could face a real justice. In Mozambique, there's no independent judiciary that could hold accountable such a high-rank government official as the finance minister. And the finance minister is the one who signed the contract to allow Mozambique to get the debt. So it was the one who signed the guarantees to get Mozambique to allow this private-owned debt, but guaranteed by the government. So it was important. Also, another stage of this struggle was to conduct investigation. So a lot of civil society organizations in Mozambique coordinated within FMO. They conducted research to collect evidence to prove that first, the debt did not benefit Mozambicans, but not all not benefiting it actually is a problem to Mozambicans, because now Mozambique can no longer pay, can no longer the government of Mozambique become completely cash strapped. The international donors, they suspended the donations to Mozambique. They were supporting about 40% of the state budget, so that was suspended. IMF also suspended the program with Mozambique. Then the consequence is that Mozambique could no longer afford paying education, health service, even security, in a context that Mozambique is facing a jihadist insurgency in the northern part of the country. So that was also very important to show that the situation of the country that is facing now is a direct consequence of the hidden debt. And a third level was to show that this debt did benefit political elites. So all that mobilization contributed to having at least 4 court cases going in 4 different countries. That is Mozambique, South Africa, the United States of America, and the UK. So all the 4 cases came to the conclusion that this debt was illegally contracted. And this was supported by the investigation or research that was conducted by civil society organizations. So to respond to your question, if Mozambique or FMO did use the odious debt doctrine, yes, even not explicitly naming it, it was the case, because what Mozambique did, what FMO did, was to show first that this debt was hidden, not authorized by the parliament, and what is hidden, it was hidden from the citizen of Mozambique. Second, it was illegally contracted because it involved bribing a high-rank official of the government of Mozambique, from the Minister of Finance, son of the former president, the head of the intelligence service, director of intelligence, economic intelligence service, and so many people who were key to approve the debt. And I'm just mentioning the names of those who were convicted in a court case. I'm not including those who are just suspected that they received bribes. And third, that the debt did not benefit Mozambican. So yes, the doctrine was applied, and all the challenge that the FMO and civil society broadly did against the debt was based on the doctrine. And lessons. Well, first lesson is that civil society organization need to be strong in order to challenge this case of debt, because they are facing very powerful people. They are, in Mozambique in particular, civil society organization were challenging someone like a director of intelligence service who was ultimately convicted 12 years in prison because of the work of civil society. So you can imagine how difficult is that situation. The director of FMO, at some point, he had to leave the country or stay locked at home. And there were threats, all kind of threats. For example, one of the director, because FMO being a coalition civil society organization, the coordination is rotative. So one of the director, Mr. Adriano Novunga, he faced a kind of challenge, people going his home and throwing bullets, AK-47 bullets, his home. That was a clear threat. And a civil society member were kidnapped, others were killed during that context. And this is something that started let me say in 2015 up to last year. So more than almost a decade of fighting against very powerful people. So you need to be strong. We need to be united and never give up. Because if you give up today, then this is the battle that you are giving up to your children, and the children of your children will have to endure it. So it's a matter of decision. As a civil society organization, you decide either you fight it today or you leave it to the next generations. And the next generation then will question what you did. So I will stop here on the sake of the time, hoping to ask some more questions, if any, during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Namire, for that intervention. And really, just Mozambique presents such a learning story for the rest of the African countries. There's so much you've touched on: the odious debt and IFF's illicit financial flows linkage. You've really shown us how those two operate in practice. And also the aspect of benefits, that you went and did actual evidence collection, and you were able to prove that it was political elites benefiting from this debt. And you also mentioned the actual conviction of individuals involved, which also takes me back to the point Dr. Gishana had made about personal liability for mismanagement of public funds. And one of the lessons that I'm also picking from Mozambique's story is the resilience that you had as the FMO and just Mozambique in general. And it seems that even Kenya and Senegal are demonstrating that resilience right now through the odious debt petition, through the citizen audits, and just the Mozambican situation also highlights as you've mentioned, your intervention is highlighting how the political reality can make it so difficult to challenge such odious debts. It can make it difficult for citizens to challenge it, even though they're being forced to repay it. And the stories of retaliation you've told us shows that it goes beyond a legal challenge. It becomes a challenge to even life. It can be dangerous to challenge odious debt in certain political contexts. So again, you've classified it as odious debt, but really so much to learn from Mozambique and connect with Kenya and Senegal at the moment. Now we'll move on to Dr. Marie-Louise Aaron, who is going to give us the more academic view and will sort of connect some of these issues for us as well. So now, Dr. Aaron, in all the three countries, it seems that ordinary citizens are ultimately bearing the cost of debt that they did not consent to or did not benefit from, and in some cases, they didn't even know existed. So how do we translate this odious debt doctrine from an academic and legal construct into a tool that citizens can actually use better? And also, how do we operationalize the odious debt doctrine? Do we need to put it in the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debts? Do we need an AU level protocol? What would help in operationalization? Over to you, Dr. Aaron.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you to the previous panelists who provided very great insights into the country level work going on regarding holding governments and other stakeholders involved in debt accountable for odious debt going on the continent. So as you've rightly identified, odious debt doctrine is still very academic. And this is so because it's still a developing area in international law, so it's not a settled law yet. In this sense, there's no legal framework that is binding on states to use odious debt doctrine to avoid paying debt. Neither is there any international tribunal or regional tribunal that has taken up this issue of debt. However, despite this limitation of its growing status, it does not mean that African states are not without any form of recourse. African states do have some leeway and opportunity to change this academic discourse into a legal or a binding legal framework in a number of ways, using existing tools at its disposal and creating a reconceptualized odious debt doctrine that can prove useful both at the regional level and at the international level. So what are some of these tools that are available to African states? So first of all, we have existing constitutions and we have statutory laws, such as our public management laws or public debt management laws and institutions responsible for that. So in many African states constitutions, for example, like Kenya and South Africa and Ghana, we already have constitutions that provide for accountability, transparency, and proper management of public resources. So this can be used to or provided in courts, and legal rights can emanate from this. It might not necessarily be odious debt legal rights, but legal rights dealing with accountability, government agency accountability can come in very handy here. And then also the courts have the opportunity to interpret some of these constitutional provisions and link them to odious debt. It might not work directly for odious debt, but it can be interpreted in such a way that it allows for greater transparency and greater responsibility on government agencies to ensure that public debt is more transparent and accessible to the public, which leads to the next point, which is freedom of information or rights to information laws. A lot of African countries do have rights to information laws. However, in practice, we find that these rights to information laws are not as accessible as they are touted. So for example, you might have Ministry of Finance publishing debt agreements, but they are not released to the public in a timely manner, particularly where the public has asked for these debt contracts to be released, or you find where some of the key provisions of the debt contract are redacted or not, or summaries are just provided. So this needs to change. So African countries can work in such a way that rights to information laws are not just in paper, but they also have to be accessible to civil societies. They have to be accessible to members of the public. And then when African governments are entering into contract with creditors, there must be opportunities or limitations placed on confidentiality information as an where freedom to information to the public is an exception or a limitation to the use of confidentiality clauses in some of these loan agreements that are entered into. Also, there's need for public debt registry, and it should be functional. It should be made accessible to those who are made to bear the greatest burden of some of these debt agreements, which is the citizen. The next way it can be operationalized is through parliamentary oversight. So currently in a lot of our parliaments, loan agreements are made available to the parliament almost at an information stage. So they are only informed about it, but not much is done. So one of the ways to operationalize holding the government accountable or operationalize using existing tools, this odious debt doctrine, is to ensure that the parliament not only receives timely information, particularly from state-owned enterprises who are one of the biggest culprits in creating debt that the citizens end up paying, but they must be allowed to review, they must be allowed to debate, they must be allowed to approve, and they must be allowed to monitor these loan agreements to ensure that they meet the responsibilities or they meet the intendment of the loans in the first place. So if the loan was contracted to create funds for infrastructure development, it must be used for that purpose and that purpose alone. Another thing is to augment the duty of the parliament is to create some type of parliamentary committee made up of experts, say for example, economists, legal practitioners, civil society, a representative from the citizens, to work alongside some members of parliament. In previous work I have handled in certain African countries, we do have where members of the parliament reach out to civil society, to ask for help when it comes to reviewing some of these contracts. So that is very much encouraged, and that is one way this committee alongside parliament can be able to track and trace any type of debt that would enter into the realm of odiousness in due time. And then the next thing that, another way to operationalize this away from the government is the role of civil society. Now, civil society, such as AFRODAD and, for example, Transparency International chapters have done a lot of good work in this regard. So sovereign debt can be very, very technical and sometimes can fly over the head of the average citizen. So civil society comes in by making these technical aspects of sovereign debt very accessible to the public through very accessible reports, through webinars such as what we are having currently. So these are ways we can make this odious debt doctrine become very accessible, that even a market woman and even a student, a primary school student, should be able to understand what odious debt is, because it eventually impacts them, whether they are aware of it or not. The second stage, I would say we can operationalize odious debt doctrine, as I mentioned previously, is to reconceptualize what odious debt doctrine is. So in the current form we have it, it is not very much applicable to Africa, because at the time it was conceptualized in 1927, it just had three primary criteria. So it, first of all, it had to do with lack of consent coming from authoritarian regime. And we know that Africa's debt has been contracted mostly by democratic regimes. So at that point, we find that that aspect of odious debt doctrine no longer works, or is not applicable to African situation, because democratically elected governments are contracting debts that are not properly consented to, or follow or bypass constitutional provisions. So this has to be reconceptualized. Another thing to do is to ensure that the debts created on this odious debt should not be borne by the citizens, such that we have to look at redefine what public benefit means to the citizens. Does public benefit mean sustainable development? Does it mean that human rights are respected? Does it mean that the citizens are able to pay less taxes? What do we mean by public benefit? So this has to be reconceptualized in a way that is applicable to African states. And then the third one is, most importantly, creditor responsibility, because with the way the international debt architecture is structured, it almost feels like the plethora of financial, legal, and moral advantages or leverage is on the side of the creditor, without corresponding obligations on the side of the creditor. So, so one of the ways to reconceptualize this odious debt doctrine is to ensure that creditors have strong due diligence obligations. So this can be operationalized by ensuring that creditors on their own conduct due diligence. They also have to conduct some type of audit to ensure that the monies that are being lent are used for the purpose they're being lent for. So that's, to my mind, the best way to start that. Once a reconceptualization has taken place of the odious debt doctrine in such a way that it works for Africa, the next thing is to start implementing it using domestic mechanisms and the African Union mechanism. So, for example, there should be the use of, or the creation of, a responsible sovereign debt borrower obligation, some type of protocol, some type of model law that should be created for Africa at the African Union stage. and which should then trickle down to countries, where countries are able to implement some of the standards that this protocol will create in their domestic laws. And then the next thing is to ensure that those protocols give rights to citizens in addition to constitutional rights that they have to challenge some of these debts that are created, which is what countries like Kenya and Senegal come in. One of the ways to go about is the use of strategic litigation. So once the rights are already there, and we have the African Union, say, for example, a protocol on sovereign debt borrowing, and maybe perhaps odious debt protocol implemented at the African Union level, then that gives extra legal rights to citizens to pursue these cases, both at domestic courts and regional courts. So these are some of the ways that governments can be held accountable. So at the end of the day, the whole idea behind sovereign debt is odious debt principle is not to hold our governments or to allow the governments to avoid paying debt, but they should. It's more about the citizens. The focus is about the citizens. Citizens should not be made to pay for debt that did not benefit them and that they were not, through their government representatives, had the opportunity to provide sufficient consent before these debts were contracted. So, and then I think you asked a question. Your question also entered into the realm of the UN Convention on Sovereign Borrowing. It's a very good way because it creates international standards, and then it's also a good way for the convention to cut across multiple stakeholders. So it's a way for borrowing governments to be held accountable, creditors of all kinds to be held accountable, including these so-called international financial institutions as well to be held accountable. But the problem or the challenge there is that while it's a good initiative in paper, it requires international political will. And the truth of the matter is that those who benefit from the status quo, which is the creditors, those who are taking advantage of Africa's vulnerability, would continually put stumbling blocks to ensure that it almost doesn't see the light of day, or it takes a very long time to become a binding protocol. So the best way is for Africa to develop its own jurisprudence on this, and then hope that, not necessarily hope, but work towards ensuring that Africa's jurisprudence almost raises to the level of customary international law, where it starts acquiring the force of international law within time. So these are some of the thoughts I have regarding operationalizing odious debt doctrine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron, for that brilliant intervention. I do see you pointed out a number of initiatives for us to take at a national, regional, continental, and also global levels, and the feasibility of those initiatives. And you've also highlighted the point of, benefit. What does the very good question that you've raised, that what does public benefit mean? What do we mean when we say that a loan must be taken in the benefit of the people? So that's something I think also to consider as we are working on reconceptualizing the doctrine. And just to summarize and cut across some of the themes that are coming from all four panelists today, there's the aspect of lack of consent and lack of benefits, and also the need to define what this public benefit is, and that creditor awareness is not really a necessary component as was conceptualized in 1927. And also the aspect of non-compliance with legal frameworks has been cutting across the case studies that we've looked at. And also the aspect of reconceptualization and operationalization seem interconnected, because you can't seem, you've highlighted, Dr. Aaron, that you can't operationalize without reconceptualizing. And that was actually one of the goals that we had when we worked with Dr. Shannon Katiba Institute in coming up with this paper on an African analysis of the doctrine. And also another point that all panelists seem to have brought out is the focus on citizens, the focus on the people, through the odious debt protocol, or through strategic litigation like in Kenya or Mozambique, or through audits in Senegal, or through civil society, as is the case in Mozambique. So really a lot to learn, a lot of similarities, as I'll pick us back to what we said at the beginning, really that three different countries, three different circumstances, but the same underlying story, that these are debts which are contracted in the shadows at the expense of the people. So now that we've had a rich discussion, thank you all for sharing your insights. I see there are already questions on the chat, but if anybody else has a question, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll be able to unmute for you. In the meantime, I'll read out what is on the chat here. There is a question from Opa Kapijimpanga. Fun fact for those who might not know, Opa is the founder of AFRODAD. About 30 years ago, he founded this organization. So I think it is important to point that out. Then he asks Dr. Gishana, is the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission the right institution to defend government when there is potential of violation of procedure? For example, offshore accounts and payments made before balances were put into consolidated accounts. The next comment here is, I like the arguments of Dr. Gishana. I'm just wondering, there's a clear score or index to balance the obligations of parties in a debt situation. In essence, balancing between consent, creditor awareness, and public benefit. Next question, again from John Murimi Njoka. If I got it correctly, Senegal's allowable debt as a percentage of the GDP is 70%. Isn't this way outside an economic measure of sovereignty? I'm asking this because even as we talk about odious debt, shouldn't countries be cautious about these percentages? Okay. Next question from Opa. Question for Mr. Elimane. In your opinion, is the hidden debt in Senegal odious? If so, what makes it so? Next, we have a question from Geoff Dubrow. Very good presentations. Given my work on parliamentary oversight of public debt, I am interested in how Kenya and Senegal can strengthen parliamentary oversight of public debt. Parliamentary approval of loan agreements, if simply rubber stamping, should not be sufficient. Has there been any discussion among CSOs or in Parliament about meaningful scrutiny of loan agreements and ongoing oversight of the effectiveness of the development projects? Now, next question from Mr. John Murimin Joka. Dr. Gishana can share if Katiba Institute is planning to emulate the Mozambique CSO's experience, because we are also having even higher odious debts. Again, from John Njoka, congratulations to the Mozambican colleagues for the resilience, indeed a great lesson. Okay, Ivan Tibenkana says, yeah, it's now sorted. I believe that might have been an accidental one. Those are the initial questions. If there are any questions, if somebody would like to raise a question and speak, you feel free to raise your hand. You will be allowed to speak. You'll be unmuted. So if you have a question at any point, feel free to raise up your hand or put it in the chat. So for now, we'll begin with the initial round of questions. There's something, I believe, for every panelist to pick on. So I will start in the same order in which we did the panel interventions. We'll start with Dr. Gishana, then move to Mr. Elimane, Mr. Namire, and then Dr. Aaron. So Dr. Gishana, over to you to address some of the questions and comments that have come up from the discussion today.
Thanks again to Afshin, and thanks to all the panelists that have been able to share the experiences from different perspectives and different countries. Obviously, one of the things we recommend in the paper also is, leveraging our collective solidarity as Africa for purposes of being able to address the challenges regarding the international financial architecture. So sharing some of these experiences is a great way to start. I'll try and respond to some of the questions that have been raised. One of them from Opa on the question of the EACC. The Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission is an independent commission that's created under the Constitution of Kenya, and it's tasked with overseeing the implementation of Chapter 6 of the Constitution of Kenya on ethics and leadership and integrity in Kenya. And there's an act of parliament also that further provides for what the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission may be able to do. I was not able to fully understand the aspect of defending the government of Kenya. One of the things you will also realize in the context of odious debt is that it's leaning more as people as against the government or people as against the state, as opposed to a situation where we are trying to defend the state as well, because most of the time the debt is procured by the state, by the government, by regimes, and the people who are then supposed to be saddled with these intergenerational repayment obligations are the ones that are coming out and saying, hey, look, this particular regime, the current one or the previous one, procured loans illegally, and therefore situations where we are defending the government might be there at the international level, but probably very minimal. But if you're asking what role the ESCC might be able to play, now, when we did the taxonomy of odious debt in the paper with AFRODAD, there are quite a number of categories which we came up with. One of the categories was loans procured through corruption. Now, it is possible, for example, in the Mozambican case, as already been explained, that yes, as a people, we have said that this is the framework for signifying our consent as a country to be bound to this particular debt contract. And therefore, if, say, for example, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance or for the National Treasury is the one that is constitutionally required to signify our consent as a people, you realize that if they signify their consent, then they have complied with the Constitution and the law signifying consent. However, if we come to realize later on that this consent was procured through corruption, the argument we make also is that that ought to be a different category of its own with respect to the classification of odiousness. So what the ESCC could do is internally be able to investigate allegations of corruption, provide evidence of corruption, internally prosecute the people who have been involved in the corruption that then led to that particular public debt. This evidence that we have a final decision of a court that has convicted someone of corruption can then be used as a basis for proceedings that are being brought for purposes of declaring a particular loan or a particular debt as having been odious. That is the role that ESCC or anti-corruption commissions or institutions at the national level may be able to do to play in providing evidence of corruption, which then can be used for declaration of odiousness. Now, the central question also that has been raised even when we were doing the validation of this paper was the nature in which we've stacked obligations between the supply side and the demand side, the supply side representing the creditors and the lenders, and the demand side representing the states that then take up these loans. And the argument is that we have overburdened the creditor with the obligations of ensuring, one, that there is consent and that the use was actually for the benefit of the people, and the debtor or the borrowing country has less obligations. Now, to be able to understand the reason why we require, obviously, what we are trying to promote is responsible sovereign borrowing and lending, not just responsible sovereign lending. So essentially, we are trying to balance the obligations and the rights of parties on both sides of the equation. And what you realize when you look at the international financial architecture is that it is generally skewed in favor of the creditors. Creditors have significant negotiating power, which can be used to be able to leverage or to compel borrowing states to ensure that, one, that the internal laws or the local laws with respect to borrowing have been complied with, and that particular borrowing is utilized with to promote or in the interests of the people. Take an example of the World Bank, take an example of the IMF. Think about the amount of leverage that they have in determining the conditions that have to be complied with even before a debt can be accessed. So insofar as the obligations are concerned, both parties have obligations to ensure that the obligations under the requirements under the odious debt doctrine are complied with insofar as consent and benefit is concerned. But we require more from the creditor because of the balance of power in that particular dynamic. But also when it comes to the consequences of a finding of odiousness, you realize that we are not just saying that a finding of odiousness results in an automatic cancellation or an enforceability of a particular loan. What we are saying is that the essence of the odious debt doctrine ought to be equity, in the sense that if there was no consent, we move to the next question as to whether there was benefit or whether that particular loan was used in the interest of the people. If the loan was used in the interest of the people, then the people will be required to repay that particular loan. In essence, therefore, the lender does not lose all. And then two, in the event that there was consent, but there was no benefit or the loan was misused or misappropriated, what we are saying is that we are only exonerating the people, removing the people from the equation and the requirement of repayment, but the creditor still has the right to pursue the individuals who took the loan and benefited personally in terms of the proceeds of borrowing. Therefore, what we have done is that as much as we have stacked the obligations a lot with respect to the lender during the borrowing and the lending stage, when it comes to the finding and the determination of odiousness, we have made efforts to ensure that there's no unconscionability is not tolerated, and then in two, there's no unjustified benefit in terms of people either benefiting at the expense of the creditor or individuals benefiting at the expense of the creditor. And with respect to the issue of KI, whether we are Katiba Institute, whether we are intending to follow in the footsteps of FMO, we intended to file our own separate petition with respect to odiousness, but then now we have, I think, about 9 individuals who already filed this case in court that is before the High Court. So what we have done as Katiba Institute is to come in and be able to, we were listed as the interested parties. So what we are doing is to ensure that where these individuals lack the legal know-how or the technical know-how insofar as public finance and public debt is concerned, we plug that gap to be able to provide legal guidance to the court, technical guidance to the court insofar as the understanding of the public finance laws and public debt and parliamentary processes are concerned. And we also critically come in to be able to elaborate to the court what is this odious debt doctrine that the petitioners want applied, what is the status under international law, and how applicable is it in the Kenyan context? Can it be applied within the current constitutional context even without directly invoking the odious debt doctrine to avoid the theoretical arguments? And can we still be able to apply it within the current definition or reconceptualization, but then using its position under international law as a general principle of law? So that's going to be our position. We will be participating in the case, and hopefully you can be able to see how then the case then handles the our support of that particular process. The whole issue of GDP to debt, and Ghana, Senegal versus Kenya, and the question of 70% being an indication of a lack of economic sovereignty. As I mentioned, the Kenyan case brings up the whole issue of debt to GDP ratio as an indicator of sustainability, debt sustainability. And the central question really is, what has GDP got to do with our ability to repay debt? Because GDP essentially is saying the totality of the goods and services we produce, when we value it, this is the value, all right? But how then does that translate to an indicator that this is then an indication of our ability to repay debt? And the argument that is being made is that it is a colonial concept intended to give you a fiscal illusion as a country that you have the capacity to repay, yet when it comes to real terms of what disposable revenue you have, then it becomes very difficult for you to repay, and therefore continually being in a cycle of borrowing and expenditure, borrowing and borrowing without an end to your dependency on debt. Parliamentary processes and how parliaments can be made more effective. The problem that we have at the moment, especially with respect to Kenya, is parliamentary capture by the national government or the executive, where the members of parliament who are supposed to be the representatives of the people in signifying consent to be bound to sovereign debt contracts, they end up being, they don't really meaningfully engage with debt documents. What they do is then they rubber stamp whatever the executive then requires. Now, what to do to be able to strengthen parliamentary oversight? One begins with electing more people with more integrity, to building the capacity of members of parliament to be able to engage, because sometimes you realize, if you look at, for example, the Kenyan case, the documents that are submitted to parliament for purposes of approval of borrowing are humongous, they're voluminous. It's not the budget policy statement, it's not the budget statement. When you go to the parliament, to the website of the National Treasury, you realize that the estimates of expenditure and the estimates of revenue, grants, and loans are very voluminous documents. So to expect a member of parliament to be able to engage, to be able to assess what is this that we're actually approving, it becomes very difficult for them to be able to engage with that. One, present the information in a way that is simple for them to understand, and two, build their capacity to be able to engage with those documents and to be able to signify their consent from an informed point of view. Back to you, Oshen.
Thank you, Dr. Rishan. I will definitely also be following the Katiba's intervention in the odieuse petition in Kenya. Thank you for highlighting these elements, and I hope to those who ask questions, the questions are answered, but if you have anything else you'd like to raise, please feel free to do so. We'll now move on to Mr. Elimane, who has to leave us in the next 17 minutes. So I'll allow Mr. Elimane to respond to the questions related to Senegal, as well as any other areas that you feel you can be, you'd be able to touch on. Those are also, you're welcome to do so. And maybe as you're giving us the responses, you could also give us your closing remarks and any additional recommendations that you might have. So then we can let you go for the next meeting. And thank you so much for being part of the webinar and sharing with us the Senegalese situation.
Thank you, it's my pleasure. Oui, je voulais répondre à trois questions qui concernent le Sénégal. La première, c'est justement la question sur les critères de Maastricht qui limitent le taux d'endettement à 70%. C'est la question de John Mourimi Yoka. Effectivement, c'est une question de souveraineté.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Limane. Sorry to interrupt. I think the English interpretation is not working. We please have that fixed. Thank you.
Yeah, let me maybe try in English, waiting for him to come back. And, I would like to respond to this question of John Morini Ndoka. I don't know if the others Francophone followers can get what I'm talking. This is the matter. I think we need to have the translator.
Maybe we can confirm if the interpreter is. Could you please confirm if you're there, if you can hear us, because we're not able to catch the interpretation. If you could just speak so we can check if we are getting the interpretation.
Okay.
Kind request to the interpreter, maybe you can speak a little so we can see if we can hear you on the English side. Please do say something so we can confirm whether we can hear you.
Okay, let me go now. Okay,
yes, the interpreter is good to go. Sorry, Mr. Elimane, for the interruption. Please proceed.
Merci. Alors, je voulais répondre à la question de John Mourimi Doka sur la question des critères de Maastricht qui limite effectivement le taux d'endettement à 70%. Je pense qu'effectivement, dans une perspective de souveraineté, et ça nous l'avons dénoncé depuis longtemps, ça n'a pas de sens pour nos États d'accepter ce genre de critères qui ne sont même pas basés sur des évidences scientifiques. Ce n'est pas scientifiquement élaboré qu'un pays ne doit pas dépasser 70% de taux d'endettement. Donc, pourquoi nous continuons à utiliser cela? C'est ça le problème. Mais ça, c'est imposé par le système international prédateur qui nous maintient dans des carcans pour mieux maîtriser nos économies. Donc, je pense qu'en Afrique, on doit pouvoir aller au-delà, développer des règles communes en Afrique qui vont au-delà de ces limitations-là et pour assumer clairement notre souveraineté. Je suis vraiment en phase sur cette question-là. Alors, sur l'autre question, par rapport à mon opinion, est-ce que ce qu'on a appelé la dette cachée, c'est la question de OPA. La dette cachée peut ne pas être exactement une dette odieuse, Mais ce qu'on a appelé la dette cachée, moi, ici, je l'ai appelé plutôt dette illégale et illégitime. Illégale parce que les procédures par lesquelles cette dette a été octroyée n'ont pas respecté la loi sénégalaise. Ensuite, illégitime parce que cette dette n'a pas été autorisée par le peuple, c'est-à-dire par le Parlement qui représente le peuple. Donc, à partir de là, je pense que on retrouve un des critères de ce qu'on a appelé la dette odieuse, c'est-à-dire absence de consentement de la population, plus l'autre critère qui est l'absence d'utilité et de bénéfices pour les populations. Ça aussi, je pense que si on arrive à prouver effectivement que l'utilisation qui a été faite de cette dette, qui a été non répertoriée ou mal répertoriée, n'a pas profité aux populations, on peut la qualifier de dette odieuse ou bien tout simplement également démontrer, et ça, c'est pas difficile à faire, qu'il y a eu une connaissance de cause des créanciers, notamment le FMI et également la BCEAO qui n'ont pas ignoré qu'il existait ces problèmes-là parce qu'il y a un premier rapport de la Banque mondiale en 2018 qui montrait également d'abord les écarts. Donc, je pense que ce n'est pas systématiquement qu'on peut lier dette, ce qui est appelé dette cachée. Moi, je ne l'appelle pas comme ça, je l'appelle dette illégale, illégitime, et ce qu'on peut appeler véritablement alors la dette odieuse. Mais c'est facile pour moi à démontrer si on fait le travail. Et justement, ce qui est intéressant pour retrouver la question de Geoff Dubrow sur comment nous pouvons travailler avec les parlements pour faire avancer cette cause. Alors, ici au Sénégal, dès qu'on a mis en place l'initiative pour le citoyen de la dette, nous avons saisi par courrier, après tout le travail médiatique qui a été fait, nous avons saisi par courrier aussi bien le président de la République, le Premier ministre et le président de l'Assemblée nationale et les deux groupes parlementaires majoritaires du pouvoir et de l'opposition à l'Assemblée nationale pour leur dire que non seulement pour l'Assemblée nationale, ils doivent mettre en place une commission d'enquête pour clarifier cette question de la dette, mais également ils doivent donc pousser à ce que le président ou le Premier ministre mette en place donc le comité de citoyens de la dette. Alors, ils n'ont pas réagi systématiquement, ils ont attendu longtemps, mais je sais que par la suite, que le groupe parlementaire majoritaire avait saisi une des organisations qui est membre de citoyens de la dette et un économiste qui est très en vue, Dr. Ndombosamba Sela, sur la question pour essayer d'avancer avec eux. Et donc, on en est arrivé là. Mais je pense qu'une collaboration structurée entre cette initiative de la société civile que nous avons prise et le Parlement devrait permettre à ce qu'on avance, qu'on fasse de grands pas en avant sur la gestion de cette dette-là. Et parce qu'aujourd'hui, au Sénégal, cette dette, elle est encore insoutenable. La gestion active de la dette nous met encore dans une austérité dans laquelle nous sommes. Et si nous suivons le FMI avec le nouveau programme qui va se mettre en place, ça va insister davantage sur l'austérité, alors que le Sénégal n'a déjà pas de marge de manœuvre budgétaire et financière. Et donc, ça mettra en place. Donc, une des mesures les plus salvatrices pour le Sénégal, c'est de suspendre le paiement d'une partie de la dette, cette partie qui est litigieuse, qui est illégale, qui est illégitime, donc qui finalement, on peut le prouver, va être une dette odieuse qu'il faut suspendre en attendant de pouvoir l'annuler tout simplement. C'est ça qui permettra au Sénégal d'avoir des marges de manœuvre, de pouvoir mobiliser des ressources pour investir, pour impulser l'économie, parce que tant que ça, c'est pas fait, effectivement, ce sera une période difficile à gérer dans ce pays-là d'ici à les années à venir, parce que tout simplement, c'est pas possible. Il faut sortir de ce paramétrage du système financier international, et donc dans lequel il y a un autre élément qui a été développé par des chercheurs récemment lors de la conférence à Dakar sur la dette, c'est-à-dire cette dette pathologique. Hein? Donc, il faut mettre en place tout simplement les mécanismes qu'il faut pour gérer ces aspects-là. Donc, c'est ce que je voulais apporter en plus. Donc, réponse et plus des orientations à faire. Maintenant, une dernière orientation, et merci beaucoup vraiment pour ta présentation à Louise, parce qu'il nous faut avoir un cadre panafricain, et à AFRODAD aussi, un cadre panafricain pour développer justement ces lois types-là, pour développer un cadre juridique et légal sur la question de la dette. Ça, on en a besoin pour instrumentaliser, pour donner des instruments à nos États et à nos citoyens pour que ce qui se passe aujourd'hui et qui nous empêche de nous développer puisse être définitivement arrêté. Voilà, je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you, Mr. Limane, for your responses to the questions. Mr. Namira has also pointed out that he has a meeting in the next 7 minutes. So we'll let him answer the questions that are related to Mozambique, after which you can give us your closing remarks and any additional recommendations you may have. Over to you, Mr. Namire.
Yes, thank you again, Afshin. I don't think there was a question directed to Mozambique. If there's any, please help me to find it. I just saw a question from John Njoka congratulating Mozambican colleagues. So on that, I need to say that the struggle continues. So it's not over because of the 2 billion USD debt, only almost half of it was cancelled. The other part, Mozambique restructured it. Mozambican government restructured it into euro bonds, and it was 100 million. But then with the restructuring, it increased. So now it's over a billion USD. So Mozambique is paying, despite that two other debts were cancelled. So the struggle continues. But also, even worse, is that winning this battle does not mean winning the war of hidden debts in the country. So the previous government, or the government that succeeded the government of President Kibuza, the one who contracted the hidden debt, also they engaged in a debt that we don't know what the whereabouts of this government. So it's very likely that Mozambicans will discover more hidden debt as the time goes if the government default the payment. So Mozambicans won the battle but did not win the struggle of hidden debt. So this is a still prevailing problem. And my closing remark is that the doctrine need to be adapted to African contexts, yes, but it's still useful. It's still useful. And that maybe the most important thing that we need to do internally as African countries is to strengthen the oversight of our own government, to prevent contracting the debt, not fighting once the debt has been contracted. So we need to find tools to prevent contracting the hidden and odious debt in our countries. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Namire. Thank you so much for being part of the webinar today. If you would like to drop off, please feel free to do so. We are almost at the closing segment. Now we'll move to Dr. Aaron, in case you'd like to address anything that has come up in the chat, or you have any closing remarks or final additional recommendations, then over to you, Dr. Aaron.
Thank you very much. I don't see how I'm going to address, because I do see some very interesting questions in the chat, and I don't see how I'm able to address some of them in the next 5 minutes. But I guess I'll do the best I can, and then leave my final closing remarks where I'm not able to address all of them. So I see a couple of questions. So starting from I think. Where it was said that at the beginning of the month, the African Union members adopted the Harare Declaration, and then a continental platform, and what should DMOs do separately. So the first thing to note is that the adoption of the Harare Declaration still doesn't give it any type of legal rights or any force of law. It's still a declaration, meaning that it just tells us what we want to do as a continent and how we want to move. But that does not derogate from its importance, because it works as a guide, and then it also creates an opportunity or a platform where all our various countries can come together to really address common problems that are facing us regarding debt and how odious debt can delve into or become. So I think one of the best ways DMOs can work differently in supporting the different member states is, first of all, in standardizing debt transparency standards. So we do have some standards, but they are still not developed as they should be, particularly to cut across the different types of the different legal systems and different standards we have in our different African laws. So one way to go about it is to create a uniform standard that, irrespective of our different political legal histories, can still different African countries can work with them. The next one I see is to create early warning mechanisms. So having a debt management network gives an opportunity for civil societies to be able to track the information provided at the network and come up with ways to inform various African countries or member states on debts delving into the realm of odiousness based on the information that has been provided. It can also provide an opportunity for more training, and then, as I mentioned previously in my discussion, ways to make this technical aspect, because debt is very technical, more accessible, that even a primary school child should be able to tell us what odious debt is and how odious debt affects. So when we have lots of people aware of what is going on, then the accountability mechanisms become very, very strong. Then also in addition to this, it's also a way for institutions that are involved in debt management. It provides an opportunity for them to also meet, for them to also provide peer reviews to each other, and regarding debt that's particularly odious debts that have been contracted, and ways we can use an African platform or an African common standard to start challenging some of these odious debt. So to the next question is that what about the judicial immunity of IFIs? Unfortunately, the IFI, particularly, for example, the IMF agreement, prevents any type of accountability for them in court. So they have absolute immunity, as you have rightly stated. However, it doesn't mean that there are not still ways to hold them accountable. If there's one thing I know about international financial institutions, is that they protect their reputation like gold. So one of the ways to hold them accountable is to, I won't say attack the reputation, but to hold them accountable and to continue to hold them in such a way that their reputation is almost at stake. Another way to go about holding them accountable administratively is for African countries to be able to come up with independent audits. So if it might not help at the court level, so in other words, we might not be able to use it to hold them at court, but it can really help with debt restructuring, because if African countries do have an independent debt audit currently in place, where they're able to trace some of these debt, how it was contracted, how it doesn't benefit the citizens, and how the citizens, particularly the intergenerational impact of some of this debt, then it can help African countries to have a stronger negotiating position when it comes to debt repayment and debt restructuring. Another way we can hold some of these IFIs responsible is to go by way of human rights and development standard, because we have binding international legal frameworks such as the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that provide that citizens have the right to good standard of living. We also have the Maputo protocol, and we have the CEDAW. So these are some human rights protocols, or human rights treaty laws that can be used to hold the government accountable, and in turn, once the pressure is put on the government, holding them accountable because they have state obligations under these conventions, then in turn, the government will be much more encouraged to hold these IFIs accountable. In addition to this, one way to also ensure that we can hold IFI accountable is to expand, and this should be done at the government level. So meaning that it's African governments who will be responsible for driving this, to expand the criteria for debt sustainability analysis to include human rights standards, because currently it's just mostly financial criteria. So what about human rights standards? What about development standards? Should this be incorporated? So these are some of the routes to hold IFIs accountable, but unfortunately, going by way of courts, particularly domestic courts, is near impossible. But using these administrative processes and reputational accountability to some extent can be as effective as holding the IFIs accountable in court. And there's also no guarantee that if the matters go before the courts will likely rule against or decide against the IFI, particularly because most of our domestic courts tend to shy away from, attaching rights to sovereign debt issues. So that's also something to look at. So the court is not the only way or mechanism to hold to ensure accountability. I think the next question is, to what extent can the African Borrower Charter that AFRODAD released help to operationalize the concept of odious debt? And what are the expectations of the new UN? So one of the ways, the extent that the African Borrower Charter can help to operationalize the concept of odious debt is that it sets the stage for the discussion. It advances. So what it does is that it provides the opportunity, as I've said, I would not want to go back repeating myself, it provides the opportunity to reconceptualize. It provides a platform where African countries can sit down to say, this is how we want to reconceptualize odious debt based on consent. So we have to expand consent. Consent must move beyond authoritarian regime to constitutional provisions, to accountability provisions, to prudent debt management provisions. And then in terms of what are the expectations for the new UN group on responsible lending and borrowing, one of the expectations we would have for them is to ensure that all stakeholders that are involved in creating odious debt and ensuring that there's hidden debts do not receive are not as transparent, and there's less accountability, should be really be the number one priority. Because currently, as I've mentioned, the international debt architecture is very pro-creditor, so it's very creditor focus. So we want to see where there's more responsibility placed on the creditors. We want to see where there's more responsibility placed on the international financial institutions. We want to also see more responsibility in terms of greater access and transparency placed on the borrower government. So in terms of creditors, we want to see more due diligence. We want to see where we ensure that they conduct independent audits by themselves. We want to see where they ensure that the reason why these loans are collected are used exactly for the purpose. We want to see that they ensure that all the constitutional and statutory provisions before debts are contracted and used are stuck to. So if the UN group is able to do just these three things, then we'll say it has achieved a lot, in addition, of course, to its other mandates. And then the current discussion on odious debt emphasize consent and public. Well, these are a lot of questions. I don't know how I'm going to answer all of them. So if the lender fails to access this, okay. So given the evolution of, should the doctrine also incorporate? Yes. So as I've mentioned, I think I've answered the question. Creditor due diligence should be present. So in other words, they must ensure that they must show that there's fiduciary control, debt sustainability. And if they fail to do this, it's still not an opportunity to say, let us derogate or let's avoid the debt. but is an opportunity to bring things to the fore. So it then shifts the onus of proving that this debt is odious from the borrower country now to the creditor. So the creditor would be in a position, or because of obligations that has been created on their side to show that they conducted due diligence, and proving due diligence is very difficult. So on this note, I think that it is very important for creditor due diligence should to be properly provided for in whatever forum, and it should be very strong to ensure that these creditors are held accountable. And then governments in Africa seem elitist and hell-bent on taking odious debt. So CSO need to be vigilant as the watchdog of the people. Absolutely. So governments, and to some extent, why the governments are complicit, the international financial architecture is not created really to favor African governments. So even though we do have African governments that might want to do the right thing, but the conditions working against them do not, particularly because of the colonial structures of debt architecture, lack of clear consent. So we don't know when consent is clear. We also don't know when benefit is clear. All this work against African governments, and also the IFIs work against African governments, even though they might not be the necessary starting point of odious debt. They perpetuate the regressive debt nature of odious debt, and then through their conditionalities and fiscal consolidation, they ensure that it still continues to work for the interest of creditors. So we can't just put the blame on African government. Everybody has a part to play, the creditors and the international financial institutions that supposedly offer supervisory or that are supposed to look at balance of payment, supervisory responsibilities, abdicate it, or they take advantage of it for the interest of creditors. So I think if we are able to, of course, look at it from these different stakeholder perspectives and ensure that everyone is held accountable, then and then African governments work together to ensure that they develop the jurisprudence of odious debt in Africa without necessarily waiting for the UN or international scholarship to catch up with odious debt doctrine, then we can say that Africa is making progress, and over time it can spread to global South countries that are facing similar issues that Africa is facing. So my final points would be that one might look at odious debt as an opportunity for African governments to want to avoid the responsibility of repayment of their loans or restructuring of loans. It's a very cheap and easy way, and that is what the global North generally likes to think about odious debt, which is one of the reasons why it has not received the development into an international standard. However, we must say that that the concept or the doctrine of odious debt is not that way. It's simply, as I've always said, about the citizen. It's ensuring that debt must be paid and used legitimately. And if it was not contracted legitimately, if it was not used legitimately, then we cannot expect the citizens to pay for this debt. And then in addition to this, there are strong international standards protecting creditors under this capitalist system that we are operating under. So we have very strong international insolvency laws protecting private parties. Why should it be any different on the side of the state simply because they are states? So it's all about making the playing field equal and level for everyone, including state parties. So on this note, I believe that odious debt should be reconceptualized to work for African citizens and for African states as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron, for addressing those questions and giving us your closing remarks. I was going to do just collating the questions and sending them to the panelists, but I can see they've largely been addressed, so we won't be doing that anymore. Apologies. We've gone a little bit over time. We'll now have to move to the closing. But if you have any further questions, you can write to us. You can write to me at afshin@afrodad.org. I will put my email in the chat, and I will now forward your question to the relevant panelists. So I'll also just put it in the chat. If you have any further questions, you can write them to me on email, and I will direct them to the relevant panelists and send you back the responses. Apart from that, for the paper on an African analysis of the odieuse debt doctrine, which seeks to reconceptualize also the odieuse debt doctrine, it has been developed internally, and we are soon going to publish it. As my colleague also shared on the chat, that the recording will be made available, so we will share the paper and the recording as well. And then just finally, a very big thank you to the panelists, Dr. Gishana, Mr. Elimane, Mr. Namire, and Dr. Aaron. You really made this a rich discussion. I was even finding it hard to interrupt anybody because there were really rich insights coming from the interventions you were making. So just a huge thank you for taking out the time to come and share with us the lessons, the experiences in the way forward on reconceptualizing and operationalizing the odieuse debt doctrine. And also, finally, a big thank you to the participants, especially, I can see most of you have still stayed, yet it's gone over time. So I'm grateful for the patience and for the interest in the subject. Thank you so much for making the time, for the interest in the webinar, for joining us today. We hope you'll be joining us for further webinars on this and other subjects as well. And yeah, thank you also for your active engagement. There were so many questions, and I was a bit nervous about whether or not we would address all of them, but I think we've managed to cover most, if not all. Thank you so much. Once again, have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. And that is it from AFRODAD. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Winston. Bye.